don't know why we. Very good, excellent. So I'm going to be talking about the data, and I have basically 10 minutes to do this. So it's obviously not going to be a literature review, but I want to give you a sense on how the data has changed over time, and particularly allowed us to find some key results in this literature. So the place to start is going to be the same that Brent started with, which is this decomposition of the real exchange rate behavior. This famous paper by Engel. What he did was very straightforward. It's essentially the equation that Brent showed you at the beginning, where you take the real exchange rate and you decompose it into basically two sides, two parts. One was, what he calls the X is basically the traded goods real exchange rate, and then you have this Y term that tells you it's sort of like a weighted average of the relative differences between non-traded and traded goods. But Engel's point was very straightforward. He wanted to show that contrary to the assumption that many people made, most of the variability in the real exchange rate was not really coming from the non-traded goods sector, but rather from the traded goods sectors that people assume LOP hold and PPP sort of hold. So he had this, every good data paper usually has a single graph that illustrates the whole point. And, he had this set of graphs where he showed essentially the share of the total variability in the real exchange rate that was coming from X. Those are these lines that you see here. And he basically found that all of it was coming from the traded goods sector. So that motivated a lot of emphasis and a lot of interest in trying to understand why. Why is it that the traded real exchange rate was failing? Now, in terms of data, he used something quite simple. He just had the CPIs and PPIs for basically 6 countries, and he had these subsectors. So he could split the sectors between what we would normally consider traded and untraded. So it was quite a straightforward paper with publicly available data. But we learned that PPP failed for traded goods. Now, the next stage was trying to understand better what was driving this. And a key paper here was Gopinath and Rigobonder's Sticky Borders paper in 2008. They came in at a time when researchers were gradually starting to have access to micro CPI data. There's the famous Bills and Clino paper. Well, Gita and Roberto, what they did is they managed to get access to microdata from the import-export price indices that the BLS collects. And any of you can get access to these days. You just have to submit a form online, tell what your project is. But these are prices that are obtained from surveys run on importers and exporters, and you have information at the product level, then the prices that, the characteristics of the good, and the prices that people are paying. And they basically found, the reason this was a great paper is, they had many results, as I said, but they basically showed that if you condition on a price change, so even at the time when the price change takes place, they found that pass-through was very low at the dog, basically 22% for US imports. So there was something more than just about price stickiness that the literature at that point seemed to believe was the main driver. So I'm going to talk later on about the paper Brent and I, together with Roberto, worked on that went into this literature. But I just want to point it out here because essentially what we found was that even at the time when you introduce a new product and the firm has the ability to change the price and sell it as it wants, even at that point, we found this big co-movement between the real exchange rate and the nominal exchange rate. So basically, the firms were not adapting to the movements in the nominal exchange rate, and they were not doing the pass-through even at a time when they were introducing new products and had the ability to do it. But I'm going to leave the discussion for the next section where I'll tell you in detail why this was happening. And if you want something more recent, a great paper to read is the paper by Blanco and Cravino, which essentially were able to collect micro CPI data from 5 countries. I cannot tell you how hard this is. It's actually hard to do it for a single country. The fact that they made it possible for 5 countries is quite surprising. They can see if you want, the raw data that the statistical agencies can collect. And they basically, again, did a simple decomposition where they calculated the real exchange rate, but then they basically divided it between the real exchange rate of goods that actually change, and then you have this other term that captures the difference between the real exchange rate of goods that change and the ones that do not change. So what they wanted to show is that if these were really about price stickiness, this difference wouldn't really matter. But in fact, what they showed is that the real exchange rate movements were actually coming from the real exchange rate of the goods that were actually changing. So clearly this is not, and I think when you look at CPI data in particular, this is not something that has to do exclusively about stickiness. Now, let me be clear, there are other papers that show that as you increase the flexibility of prices, you do get more pass-through, and that's certainly true, but the point I'm making, was not, there's a lot of evidence in the literature that this is not the only element. One of the elements that became quite important was this idea that the currency of invoicing really matters. And you know, Gita Gopinath and Oleg and Roberto have this paper in 2010 that I think made it also very clear. They found that there is a very large difference between the pass-through of US imports priced in dollars versus those priced in non-dollars. They are basically using the same data set they had used before in the sticky borders paper. This is the microdata of the import-export price indices. And one of the surprising findings of the paper was that these differences in pass-through that you're seeing in this picture. Below here we have the pass-through of the price of the goods that are imported but are invoiced in dollars, and on the top you get the pass-through of non-dollar imports into the US. Was the fact that what was very surprising was the fact that this lasted so long for such a long horizon, no? Which led to a lot of interest in understanding what is really driving this decision of what is the currency of invoicing. It's something that is quite sticky, if you want, in the sense that the firms stick to this paradigm quite a lot. But it changed the literature. I think Brent was discussing this PCP versus LCP type of theories that we were working with, and this sort of showed us that for a country like the US, in fact, it was PCP for exports, LCP for imports, and when you looked at trade data, everything, most things seem to be priced in dollars. So it led to all these subsequent papers on the dominant currency pricing, and Gita has many papers on that. I'm just listing here one of the latest ones, but the idea here was that there was you know, a share of the variability that you observe and in the degree of pass-through is closely related to the share of imports that are actually priced in this dominant currency, which is the US dollar. And as Brent was saying towards the end of his talk, we started getting interest in what other things beyond stickiness and currency of invoicing mattered. And we had this set of papers by Amity, Stocky, and Koning. They basically had access here. The data changed a little because they started looking more closely at the border data, but at customs data. They gained access to very detailed data set on Belgian exporters. They could see you know, where they were selling their goods, what prices they were setting, and they could also understand very well what were the countries where they're importing as well, because they're basically exploiting a fact that becomes quite obvious in trade data, which is that large exporters are also large importers. No? So using this data, they basically showed that large firms that have high import shares were actually having a very relatively lower exchange rate pass-through onto the prices that they set. And there are two words that I would highlight here. One is the large, and the other one is the import shares. No? So these essentially are two mechanisms. The large firm mechanism was about having these markups that they could decide to change as the shock happened. You know, they have this ability, like Brent was describing, this variable markup type of story allowed them to do so. And then you had these import shares, which essentially was the mechanism that would allow them to have an offsetting effect on the exchange rate pass-through. So you know, in this context, you can think of an exporter that faces a depreciation, for example, of the currency. They would have an incentive to lower the price at which they sell in dollars abroad, if you're talking about a Belgian firm. But then on the other hand, they had these offsetting effects because their inputs are becoming more expensive, and that reduces the degree of exchange rate pass-through. Now, the data itself, when you look at it, it's essentially custom information. We can see these you know, trade flows in great details, and the ability to identify the source country and the export destination made a big impact. the source of the data, this was collected by the Belgian Central Bank, which is also a statistical agency. So in a sense, it was a great thing that they were able to connect through other people to this data. They had a follow-up paper recently, which is also interesting. I'm gonna skip it in the interest of time, but just let me tell you briefly, what they did is now they looked more internally to see how firms were reacting with the prices of they set domestically when they took into account the prices of competing firms, and they could really link the firms and understand who were competing with whom. So they looked at strategic complementarities and noted that there is lower cost pass-through when they can observe even the costs that these firms have, and under certain conditions that leads to lower exchange rate pass-through, and that's the link to the literature. So worth looking if you're interested in those dimensions about real rigidities and strategic complementarities. And finally, since we've mostly been talking about what happens at the border, I thought I should tell you what's happening at the consumer level, because I'm going to talk a lot about that in the next session. The papers we had in the literature, I'm going to highlight two. First, the Bernstein, Neves, and Rebelo paper in 2003, I think started a lot of interest in this side of the literature. And the idea here is, even if you find incomplete pass-through at the border, when you look at the consumer level, the retail level, and the CPI, which matters because of inflation dynamics, for example, that Brent was referring to, they realized there was this extra component, the distribution cost, that will allow those shocks that creep into the border prices to even have less of an effect at the consumer level. No? And they basically try to use surveys, input-output tables, and compare the markups or the price difference, between wholesale and retail prices to estimate what is the domestic, if you want, component of this distribution cost. They estimated it was 40% in the US, 60% in Argentina, so it was quite high. Most estimates in the literature around give you around this 50% range, and they studied this real exchange rate dynamics. But more recently, I would say, and more comprehensively, because it took care of a lot more countries, was the paper by Goldberg and Campa, where they showed that CPI pass-through is actually reduced by 1/3 when you take into account these distribution margins. Okay, this is the dampening effect on the exchange rate pass-through. Now, they also noted that many of these distribution services that we tend to think as non-tradable actually use imported inputs as part of the service. No? So to that extent, they noted that the relationship was not so straightforward. It also had this imported inputs component that could enhance the impact that a exchange rate shock could have on the level of pass-through that they're willing to pass on to the consumer prices. And for these, they used these input and output tables and CPIs for about 21 developed countries. So what am I trying to convey here? I hope you get a sense that the data has been changing. I mean, it's not just a matter of getting bigger, having more coverage, but also in the types of details these data sets have that allow us to test different mechanisms. So I've listed all the papers that I've mentioned today and the topics here. And you can see at the beginning, we mostly had CPIs and PPIs, data that was publicly available. We've moved into having access to the microdata behind the official statistics, both the CPI and the import exports price indices. And there's also a lot of data on customs that are collected by customs, which are the type of data that Oleg and Mary have used in the case of Belgium. There are many other papers on this line. What is missing from this picture so far is what happens at the retail level with microdata. So that's what I'm going to be talking about next. I'm going to be describing the efforts we did to collect data online and really see what was happening with prices at the retailer level. But I'm going to leave that to the break, and I think we can answer your questions at this stage. Thank you.
Okay, we're